There are stars who leave the spotlight because of a shocking scandal. There are stars who disappear after a downward spiral from which there is no recovery. But Nancy McKeon belongs to neither category. She stepped away from the center of Hollywood at the very peak of her career. No scandal, no crisis, no dramatic explanation splashed across the headlines. That is precisely what kept the public fascinated for decades. A woman who had once been one of America's most beloved television faces chose to quietly walk away from the whirlwind of fame at the very moment when most people would have done everything possible to hold on to it. For many years, the question, where did Nancy McKeon go, became a form of collective nostalgia for those who grew up watching The Facts of Life. A handful of articles, a few rare interviews, and a great deal of silence. That was all the public ever received. Ironically, that silence sparked more curiosity than any large-scale publicity campaign ever could. Now, as Nancy McKeon approaches her 61st birthday, the picture of her life has finally become clearer than ever before. It is not a story of decline, but a story of choice. To fully understand and answer the questions that remain in everyone's mind today, we need to look back on a long journey. Stay with us as we search for the real answers. Before she was Joe Polniak, before she became an icon to millions of American viewers in the 1980s, Nancy McKeon was simply a child born on April 4th, 1966 in New York into a family where creativity seemed to run through the bloodline. Her parents introduced their children to the world of entertainment at a very early age, and Nancy did not enter alone. She had a constant companion throughout her childhood, her brother Philip McKeon. The two siblings worked as child models together, appeared in advertising campaigns together, and learned how to stand in front of camera before they had even finished growing up. It was an unusual childhood, not one filled with carefree afternoons of play, but one spent in casting rooms under studio lights and moving from one audition to the next. Yet, the bond formed between the two siblings during those early years would become one of the most valuable things in her life, and decades later, the source of her greatest heartbreak. The real turning point came in 1980. At just 14 years old, an age when most children were still occupied with homework and everyday teenage concerns, Nancy McKeon joined the cast of The Facts of Life, a sitcom centered on the lives of girls attending a boarding school. She was cast as Joe Polniak, and it was this role that would completely change the course of her life. Joe's was not the typical sweet girl often seen on television at the time. She came from a working-class family in the Bronx, was strong-willed, stubborn, and frequently seen wearing a leather jacket and riding a motorcycle, a striking contrast to her more privileged roommates. Yet beneath that tough exterior was a rare authenticity. Joe was vulnerable, fiercely loyal to the people she cared about, and constantly fighting to remain true to herself. In a world that was not built for someone like her, American audiences, especially many young women of that era, saw themselves in Joe Polniak. She was no longer merely a fictional character. She became a friend, a role model, and a voice for those who felt different. Nancy McKeon remained at the role for 9 years and 201 episodes, a span long enough for a fictional character to become intertwined with the actor's real-life identity. By 1988, as The Facts of Life approached its final episodes, Nancy McKeon had become one of the most recognizable faces in America. She was not simply a successful young actress. She was part of childhood memories, part of the collective cultural experience, part of an entire generation that grew up gathered around the family television every Wednesday evening. Yet at that very peak, few could have imagined that Nancy McKeon had no desire to remain forever defined by the image of a rebellious girl from the Bronx. She wanted something more. If one looked only at Joe Polniak, it would have been easy to assume that Nancy McKeon was a kind of actress forever tied to a single archetype, the tough, street-smart, humorous young woman. Yet, even while The Facts of Life was still on the air, and especially after it ended, Nancy consistently sought roles that were completely different, as though she were trying to prove to herself, not merely to audiences, that she had far more to offer than the image of a rebellious girl from the Bronx. In 1986, she portrayed a female firefighter in the television film Firefighter, inspired by the true story of one of the first women to join the Los Angeles County Fire Department, a workplace dominated by men and filled with prejudice and pressure. A year later in Strange Voices, she played a young woman living with schizophrenia, a role that demanded remarkable sensitivity and emotional depth far removed from the bright and familiar screen presence audiences knew. Perhaps the most powerful role of this period, however, was A Cry for Help, the Tracy Thurman story in which Nancy played the lead character based on the real-life story of Tracy Thurman, a survivor of severe domestic abuse whose case later became a landmark legal precedent that changed the way American law addressed domestic violence. These were not the kinds of roles actors choose simply to preserve a public image. They were the kinds of roles chosen by performers who genuinely wished to challenge themselves, to engage with stories that carried real weight, and to leave audiences reflecting long after the screen went dark. For an actress barely in her 20s, repeatedly pursuing psychologically and socially demanding roles revealed something important. Nancy McKeon never wanted to be merely a beloved television star. She wanted to be a serious actress, and she quietly worked toward that goal even while the public continued to remember her primarily as Joe Nyack. That desire to experiment, to live many different lives through acting, continued to shape her choices throughout the following decade until another decision, one far more personal, emerged and completely altered the trajectory of her life. There is a small but thought-provoking story worth pausing to consider. In 1994, when producers were casting a new sitcom called Friends, Nancy McKeon was reportedly considered for the role of Monica Geller, a role that would later make Courtney Cox one of the biggest names in American television for an entire decade. Had that casting decision gone differently, Nancy McKeon's name might become forever associated with one of the most successful sitcoms in television history rather than with the facts of life. But fate, or perhaps simply the closing of one door so that another could open, led her down an entirely different path just 1 year later in 1995. In circumstances that were anything but glamorous on the set of a Hallmark television film called A Mother's Gift, Nancy met Mark Andress, a Texas-born cinematography technician working in the camera and cinematography department. Mark was not someone people search for on Google. He had no celebrity status, no career in front of the camera, and most importantly, he had no interest in fame. For a woman who had spent her entire childhood and youth living under the public gaze, it was perhaps Mark's calm, unassuming nature that made Nancy feel truly herself for the first time in many years. They did not rush into anything. 8 years passed before they decided to marry, a period long enough to prove that this was not a fleeting entertainment industry romance, but a relationship built on genuine understanding. On June 8, 2003, Nancy McKeon and Mark Andress held a wedding so simple that it surprised many people. Only around 20 guests, no red carpet, no paparazzi, and not a single journalist invited to cover the event. For someone who had once been a familiar face to an entire generation of American television viewers, it was a quiet yet unmistakable statement. She chose privacy. She chose the people who truly mattered to her rather than choosing public attention. After the wedding, Nancy and Mark moved to a ranch near Austin, Texas, thousands of miles away from the noise and pressures of Los Angeles. There she gave birth to their 2 daughters, Aurora, 2004, and Harlow, 2006, and devoted the following years to raising them in a peaceful environment far removed from media scrutiny. She did not disappear because she had stopped loving acting. She stepped away because she had found something that Hollywood could never give her, a slower, more meaningful life, one to be enjoyed in tranquility, where fame was no longer the sole measure of a life well lived. But leaving Hollywood did not mean completely abandoning her profession. In fact, while living in Austin, Nancy began a new chapter in her career, one that attracted little attention, but revealed more clearly than ever her ability to balance passion with personal life. Before leaving Los Angeles, during her time portraying Inspector Jenny Stead in Lifetime's police drama, The Division from 2001 to 2004, Nancy had the opportunity to explore directing, personally directing several episodes of the very series in which she was starring. It was a relatively uncommon step for an actress in the midst of a thriving acting career, demonstrating that Nancy did not simply want to tell stories through performance. She wanted to learn how to tell stories from behind the camera, as well, shaping an entire narrative from the perspective of the person creating it. Even earlier in 1999, she wrote and directed a short film titled Awakening, a small and little project, yet clear evidence that she had been nurturing a desire to pursue her craft in more creative ways long before leaving Hollywood behind. Then in 2009, when her daughters were a little older and life in Texas had settled into a comfortable rhythm, Nancy unexpectedly returned to television in a role that was symbolic in its own unique way. She played the mother of the character portrayed by Demi Lovato in Disney's hit sitcom Sunny with a Chance. It was a fascinating bridge between two generations of teenage idols. The woman who had been Joe Pony in the 1980s, a symbol of one generation of American teenagers, was now appearing as the mother of a completely new teen icon of the 2000s. For those who had grown up watching Nancy in The Facts of Life and later watched their own children grow up with Sunny with a Chance, it was a nostalgic coincidence, almost a reminder that time continues to move forward. Yet familiar faces sometimes find a way to return, even if only for a brief moment. These projects, while quiet and free from sensational headlines, clearly demonstrate how Nancy McKeon chose to maintain her connection to a profession she had once loved, not by clinging to the spotlight, but by carefully selecting opportunities that genuinely mattered to her at the moments when she felt ready for them. And nearly a decade after her small role in Sunny with a Chance, an entirely different opportunity, one that was more of a personal challenge than anything she had done before, emerged and brought her name back into the public eye in a way no one expected. In 2018, at the age of 52, Nancy McKeon did something that almost nobody saw coming. She officially returned to the spotlight of live television, this time not as an actress, but as a contestant on the 27th season of Dancing with the Stars, one of America's biggest reality television shows. She was paired with Val Charovsky, a veteran professional dancer on the program, and a two-time winner of the coveted Mirrorball Trophy. During an introductory interview with Val on Good Morning America, Nancy admitted that she was not entirely sure whether everything would click, but she was determined to give it a try. It was a surprising decision for someone who had spent many years living a quiet life in Texas. Unlike acting a role where an actor can hide behind a character, participating in Dancing with the Stars meant standing before millions of viewers entirely as herself, with no protective layer, facing weekly judging, scoring, and the possibility of elimination on live television. It required a completely different kind of courage from acting, a far more vulnerable form of self-exposure. Nancy's journey on the competition was brief. She and Val were eliminated in week 3 during the emotional Most Memorable Year theme night, when contestants traditionally share one of the most meaningful personal stories of their lives through dance. Nancy chose to perform a Rumba and honor her family, a choice that was easy to understand when looking back at everything she had experienced, from her childhood bond with her brother Philip to her quiet marriage with Mark, to the 2 daughters she had spent more than a decade raising in peaceful surroundings near Austin. Although she did not advance far in the competition, Nancy left the stage with a sense of contentment, saying that she was happy to step away at a beautiful moment rather than trying to hold on for longer. Looking back, Dancing with the Stars in 2018 can be seen as an emotional stepping stone, a chance to step outside her comfort zone and stand before the public in an entirely new way, not through a scripted character, but as her authentic self. Yet, just 1 year after that moment, Nancy McKeon's life would take a dramatically different turn, not through a professional opportunity, but through a series of profound losses unlike anything she had ever faced. Some years shape an entire life not through triumphs, but through losses for which no amount of preparation could ever be enough. For Nancy McKeon, 2019 was one of those years. It began in October when her father, Donald McKeon, the man who had introduced both Nancy and Philip to the world of entertainment when they were still small children, who had sat beside them during their earliest auditions, and who had watched his daughter grow into one of America's most beloved television personalities, passed away. For anyone, losing a father is a shock that no one can truly prepare for, even when they know that day will eventually come. But for Nancy, it was only the beginning of what would become the most painful autumn and winter of her life. Just 2 months later, on December 10th, 2019, another devastating blow followed. Philip McKeon, her only brother, her childhood companion from the days when they modeled for Sears advertisements together, the person who had grown up alongside her in casting rooms and who had later stood behind the camera directing productions in which his younger sister starred, passed away at the age of 55 after a long and private illness that the family never publicly discussed in detail. Family spokesman Jeff Ballard confirmed the heartbreaking news on a cold Tuesday morning, saying with deep sorrow, "We are all beyond devastated and heartbroken over Phil's passing. He added that Philip's wonderful sense of humor, kindness, and loyalty would always be remembered by everyone fortunate enough to have known him. Just imagine it. Losing her father and then losing her only brother, the person with whom she had shared her entire life since childhood, within the space of only 2 short months. These were not 2 separate events. They were waves of grief crashing one after another with barely enough time to recover from the first before being struck by the second, even more devastating loss. There's one small yet heartbreaking detail that makes it all the more painful. Only a month before Philip passed away, on his birthday, November 11th, Nancy had posted an old photograph of the 2 of them on Instagram, accompanied by a message that read, "Happy birthday to my big brother. It's been a tough time lately, but like we always say, we'll get through it together. Love you, dude." 1 month later, the person to whom she had written those words was gone. Amid all that turmoil and grief, there's a small story that reveals a great deal about Nancy McKeon's character. At the very time her family was enduring these losses, she was still involved in filming Lifetime's television movie, You Light Up My Christmas, reuniting with former castmates from The Facts of Life. Kim Fields, who served as both the lead actress and executive producer of the project, later shared that Nancy had been dealing with an unexpected and incredibly difficult family situation during production to the extent that her scenes had to be filmed remotely. Yet, even while standing in the midst of the greatest personal sorrow of her life, Nancy refused to abandon her commitment to the project. She simply said, "I'm still going to do this." It is a small detail that many people overlooked, but it reveals something essential about who Nancy McKeon is. No matter how much pain she was carrying, she chose to stand firm, to honor her word, and not to allow personal grief to undermine the commitments she had made to others. And then, in keeping with the way she had lived throughout her entire life, placing privacy above public exposure, Nancy McKeon did not appear on talk shows to recount her grief. She did not give lengthy interviews discussing her emotions, nor did she turn her family's loss into something for public consumption. Instead, she chose a far simpler and more personal form of expression: brief messages on social media accompanied by faded photographs from years gone by. A picture of her father playing catch with Philip as a child. A photograph of the 2 siblings standing together before a camera in their early years, much as they had at the beginning of their careers.